The dust rolled across the ruined outskirts of the city as Corporal Elena Marquez adjusted the scope of her rifle, the heavy weapon cradled against her shoulder like it was an extension of her own body. The heat shimmer made the distance deceptive, blurring shapes until they looked like ghostly silhouettes in the wreckage. She could hear the low rumble of engines somewhere beyond the smoke and knew the enemy was still pressing their assault. For weeks, their armored columns had been pounding the last defenders of the city into rubble, and morale was bleeding away with every casualty. Inside the makeshift command post, some of the officers muttered that Elena was not up to the task, that a woman in her mid-20s with barely 3 years of field service could not be trusted to hold the line when everything was collapsing. They said her arms were too thin to handle the recoil of the long-range anti-material rifle. They said her nerves would snap the first time she had to stare through the scope and choose between pulling the trigger or letting her brothers in arms die. But Elena had learned long ago that people's doubts were just another kind of battlefield noise. She had grown up in a broken part of the world where survival required silence, precision, and a heart that could steady itself against fear. That morning had begun with shelling that shook the entire western sector. The enemy had encircled the defenders and pinned them inside a narrow corridor that led to the last functioning supply route. The barricades were barely holding, and every soldier knew that if the armored spearhead broke through, the siege would end in slaughter. Elena's unit had been ordered to retreat to secondary positions, but her commanding officer, Major Dravik, had pulled her aside and whispered what the others would not dare to say aloud. If their command vehicle makes it into range, we're finished. No amount of small arms fire will matter. We need a miracle shot. Can you do it? Elena had looked at him without hesitation. She didn't ask about the distance, the wind, or the impossibility of threading a bullet across 2 miles of heat, debris and shifting air currents. She only nodded and said, "Give me the coordinates." The major studied her face as though still wrestling with the same doubts the others voiced behind her back, but eventually he tapped her shoulder and gave the order. Now she lay on her belly in the ruins of a collapsed apartment block, the cracked concrete beneath her ribs, the long barrel of her rifle extending over broken rebar and shattered glass. Her spotter, Sergeant Keller, crouched beside her, adjusting his rangefinder and muttering calculations under his breath. Wind at 11 knots, shifting left to right, target distance 2,180 meters. Christ, Elena, you sure you want to take this? She didn't answer. Her breathing slowed, each inhale drawn deep, each exhale measured. The scope's reticle hovered over a faint shape in the distance, a black silhouette half hidden by smoke plumes and moving armor. It was the enemy's mobile command carrier, a reinforced beast bristling with antenna arrays and shielded plating. If it broke through to the front, the enemy would coordinate their final push, and the defenders would be overrun within the hour. Elena felt the weight of every life in the city pressing against her shoulders. She adjusted the elevation knob a fraction, compensated for the crosswind, and whispered a number to Keller. He frowned, rechecked his data, then gave her a look that mixed fear with awe. "That's threading a needle through a hurricane," he muttered, but he didn't stop her. Elena's finger brushed against the trigger, but she didn't squeeze yet. She had been taught that the shot didn't belong to the weapon or the soldier. It belonged to time itself, to the one perfect moment when chaos opened and precision could slip through. Seconds stretched into eternities as she waited, her eyes steady on the moving command carrier. Inside her mind, she shut out the roar of distant gunfire, the crack of mortars, and the cries of wounded men echoing through the ruins. She was no longer Elena Marquez, doubted soldier, dismissed woman. She was nothing but a line of sight and a pulse synced with steel. The first opportunity came when the carrier slowed to reposition behind a burned-out bus. She drew in half a breath, held it, and began to squeeze, but at the last second a column of smoke gusted into her view and blanketed the target. She eased her finger back, exhaling softly. Keller cursed under his breath, but she remained calm. She knew patience was as deadly as any bullet. Another 30 seconds ticked by, each one echoing like a drumbeat of death for the men still holding the barricades. Her ear caught the crackle of comms, urgent voices reporting that the barricade was buckling, that armored tracks were grinding closer. Still she did not fire. Still she waited. And then it came, the brief, impossible opening. The carrier emerged from behind the smoke, its reinforced window glinting just enough to mark the cockpit where the enemy commander sat. The rangefinder beeped its confirmation. Elena's finger closed on the trigger. The rifle roared like thunder, the recoil driving into her shoulder, but her body absorbed it like stone. The bullet tore free, a supersonic shard cutting through 2 miles of tortured air. For a heartbeat, nothing happened, only silence, disbelief, and the endless stretch of distance. Then, with a flash too small to notice except through her scope, the round punched straight through the armored glass. Inside the command carrier, chaos erupted as the commander's skull snapped backward, lifeless before his men even realized they'd been breached. The vehicle lurched, swerved, then ground to a halt as its crew scrambled in confusion. For the soldiers on the barricades, it was as if a shadow lifted. The advancing armored units faltered, their coordination severed. The enemy push dissolved into hesitation, and in that hesitation, the defenders surged forward with renewed fury. Mortars found their marks, machine guns raked the now disorganized enemy, and the line held. Elena's shot had cut the head from the snake, and the siege that had seemed inevitable crumbled in seconds. Keller let out a laugh that was half hysteria, half triumph. 2 miles, Elena, and you dropped him like he was 10 feet away. But she didn't smile, didn't bask in the sudden chorus of cheers crackling through comms. She only adjusted her scope, chambered the next round and whispered, "The fight isn't over. Not yet." For Elena Marquez, the shot wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about survival, about the lives that depended on her silence, patience, and precision. The world might remember the siege-ending kill as a legend, but for her it was just one moment in a war that had no end in sight. The silence after the shot lingered longer than anyone expected. It wasn't the silence of peace, nor the quiet relief of survival. It was the stunned pause of men and women realizing they were still alive because of a single impossible act. The defenders at the barricades erupted with renewed determination, but Elena and Keller remained prone on the shattered concrete. Elena kept her cheek pressed to the scope, scanning for any sign that the enemy had adapted. She knew too well that victory didn't announce itself with fanfare. It crept in slowly, precarious and fragile, until the wrong decision shattered it again. Keller tugged lightly on her sleeve. "Elena, you did it. They're falling back. We need to reposition before they triangulate." His words were practical, sharp, and urgent, but his voice carried something he had never directed at her before: respect. The man who once doubted her steadiness now spoke with the reverence reserved for survivors who had witnessed the impossible. She shifted slightly, rolling onto her side and letting the barrel of the rifle cool against the rubble. Her shoulder ached from the recoil, a deep bruise already spreading under her fatigues, but she didn't complain. Pain was a minor tax, one she paid willingly. Around them, the sounds of battle were shifting. Where there had been a relentless hammering of enemy artillery, there was now scattered fire, frantic and disorganized. The command vehicle lay smoldering in the distance, half its crew trying to drag the lifeless body of their commander from the wreck while others stumbled in chaos, leaderless. It was not complete victory, not yet, but it was the break the defenders had prayed for. Major Dravik's voice came crackling through the comms, heavy with disbelief. Confirm, was that you?" Elena picked up her mic calmly, voice flat, steady. "Target neutralized, sir. Command vehicle disabled." There was a pause on the line, followed by a wave of cheers and shouts that spilled across every channel. The major didn't join the chorus. Instead, his tone was firm, almost fatherly. "You just saved this city, Corporal. But don't let that scope out of your hands yet. They won't quit over one loss." She answered with the same discipline as before, "Understood." She knew he was right. Armies did not collapse in an instant. They reeled, they regrouped, they came back with bloodlust. Her shot had bought them breathing room, but time was as fragile as glass, and it shattered quickly under steel tracks. Keller leaned back, wiping sweat from his forehead. His eyes were still locked on her as though trying to reconcile the soldier beside him with the miracle he had just witnessed. "They said you couldn't do it," he muttered, voice low. "They said you weren't ready. Hell, I said it once myself. Guess we were all wrong." Elena didn't look at him. Her gaze stayed on the horizon, where smoke plumes still curled into the pale sky. "It doesn't matter what they said," she replied. "It only matters what happens next." She chambered another round and adjusted her position, every motion automatic, practiced. Doubt was a ghost she had learned to ignore long ago. The defenders began pushing forward to reclaim ground that had been lost during the morning bombardment. Small squads moved cautiously through alleys and broken streets, checking every corner for ambushes. The enemy was still out there, infantry scattered, armored units stalled but not destroyed. Elena tracked their movement through her scope, feeding Keller information to relay to the forward squads. Each time a hostile sniper shifted on a rooftop, each time a machine gun nest revealed itself in the smoke, Elena's rifle cracked once and the threat was gone. The myth of her 2-mile shot was already spreading among the soldiers, lifting their spirits higher than any speech could have. For the first time in weeks, the defenders believed the siege could be broken. But belief was a dangerous thing. Elena knew that morale could swing like a pendulum. One wrong move, one surprise counterattack, and hope could collapse into despair faster than it had risen. That truth gnawed at her even as she kept firing, even as Keller whispered coordinates and confirmed kills. Her mind replayed the moment of her impossible shot, not as triumph but as responsibility. She hadn't just killed a commander, she had become the anchor of an entire front. If she faltered now, if she missed when it mattered again, the collapse would be blamed on the very soldier they had doubted in the first place. As night began to fall, the ruins glowed with fires that refused to die. Keller suggested they relocate to a higher vantage point for night operations, and Elena agreed without hesitation. They picked their way through rubble and dust, rifles ready, ears tuned to the smallest sound. Every shadow seemed alive, every flicker of light carrying the weight of unseen eyes. They reached the skeletal remains of an office tower, climbed its broken stairwell, and settled near a shattered window on the 12th floor. From there, the city spread beneath them like a corpse draped in smoke. Elena set her rifle on the edge, her scope sweeping slowly across the burning horizon. It didn't take long to confirm her fear. In the distance, beyond the wreckage of the command vehicle, new headlights pierced the dusk. More armor was coming. This wasn't retreat, it was reinforcement. The enemy had lost their commander, but their machine still rolled forward, and somewhere in the haze, another officer would be stepping up to fill the void. Elena's jaw tightened. Keller cursed under his breath, slamming a fist lightly against the crumbled wall. They're not stopping. We cut the head off and they grew another one. Elena didn't respond immediately. She adjusted her scope, measured the angles and spoke softly, almost to herself. Then we cut again. Her finger brushed the trigger once more, but this time there was no easy target, no commander foolishly exposing himself behind glass. The reinforcements were disciplined, advancing in staggered formation, their armor angled against sniper fire. It would take more than a miracle shot to stop them now. Elena knew the coming hours would decide whether her legend became a fleeting rumor or the foundation of survival for thousands still trapped in the city. She had made one impossible shot, but war was never won with just one bullet. The night was only beginning, and she could feel the weight of every unseen enemy moving closer with each heartbeat. For the first time since morning, Elena closed her eyes for a single breath, steadying herself. She didn't think about the praise or the doubt, or the whispers that followed her through every deployment. She thought only of the simple truth: a soldier's duty was never finished. She opened her eyes again, pressed her cheek to the stock and whispered to Keller, "Mark the first target. The siege isn't over. It's just changing shape." And with that, the hunter became the city's shield once more, ready to face the storm that was gathering in the darkness. The night swallowed the city whole, but it wasn't silence that came with the darkness. It was noise, different from the shelling of the day but no less suffocating. Engines rumbled in the distance, the clanking of treads against broken asphalt echoing faintly through the ruins. Sporadic bursts of gunfire rattled from alleys where small squads still skirmished. The defenders had tasted hope after Elena's impossible shot, but now every soldier understood what the new sound meant. Reinforcements were arriving heavier than before, and the fight had only shifted into a deadlier phase. Elena lay prone at the shattered window of the office tower, her rifle already trained outward, scope catching brief flashes of movement in the moonlight. Keller sat behind her, rangefinder against his eye, muttering under his breath as if the numbers themselves could hold back the inevitable. "They've got at least a company moving in," he said finally, his voice low but edged with urgency. "That's 6 or 7 armored transports, maybe more with infantry dismounts. And they're spreading out. Smarter than before. They learned from what you did." Elena didn't respond right away. Her scope swept across the terrain, catching glimpses of armor lights blinking like predators' eyes. Each movement confirmed Keller's report. The enemy was adjusting. No more reckless command vehicles placed at the front. No more clear shots. If she wanted to replicate the miracle of the morning, she would need more than precision. She would need to find a weakness they didn't know they had. Her mind went back to her childhood, years before she wore the uniform, back to nights when she had lain awake in villages under siege by warlords who had no name and no flag. Back then, survival came from watching the patterns. The way footsteps betrayed the direction of patrols, the rhythm of their movements, the moments when fear or arrogance made them sloppy. She had carried that habit into her training, and now she let her eye drink in every detail through the glass of her scope. One vehicle lingered longer at intersections than the others. Another stayed closer to infantry screens, its commander paranoid enough to hug cover but not disciplined enough to stay invisible. Each detail built a picture in her mind, a puzzle of metal and men that could be broken if one piece was pulled apart. Keller adjusted his position beside her. If they hit the barricade again with this much force, it won't hold. Even with morale high, we don't have the numbers. Best case, we buy another few hours. Elena whispered, almost too softly for him to hear, "Hours are enough." She marked the second transport in her scope, tracking its speed. If she could force hesitation into their advance the way she had in the morning, every hour gained meant reinforcements for her own side might arrive. That was the hidden war time. Whoever controlled the clock controlled the outcome. The comms crackled, Major Dravik's voice breaking through, tired but steady. "Marquez, Keller, report. What are you seeing?" Keller pressed the mic, glancing at her for confirmation. She nodded once, never leaving her scope. "Enemy reinforcements moving in," Keller relayed. "Armor and infantry, staggered formation, estimated company strength. They're adapting." There was a pause, then Dravik's voice returned, steel underlined with the weight of dwindling options. "Understood. Hold them as long as you can. We're evacuating civilians from the southern quarter. Every minute counts." Elena closed her eyes for a second. Civilians. Families. Children. It wasn't just soldiers depending on her trigger finger, it was the entire lifeblood of the city. Her eyes snapped open again, focus sharpening. She shifted her rifle slightly, searching for something beyond a kill. She wasn't looking to drop another commander, she was looking for a choke point, a place where one shot could ripple into chaos. And then she saw it, between the shifting vehicles, a narrow overpass where two transports had to pass in single file. If she could disable the lead vehicle there, it would bottleneck the rest, freezing their advance. It wouldn't stop them forever, but it could stall them long enough for the evacuation to continue. Her pulse slowed as she whispered the plan to Keller. He frowned, then nodded quickly. "Risky. They'll know where you are the second you take the shot." She adjusted her breathing. "Then we make it count." They waited, the seconds dragging like hours as the convoy rolled closer. The sound of treads against concrete echoed louder, vibrating through the ruined tower. Elena aligned her scope on the lead vehicle, her finger brushing the trigger, heart syncing with the slow rhythm of her breath. She thought of the city behind her, of the civilians filing through darkened alleys toward the southern quarter, their lives strung on a fragile thread. She thought of the doubts, the whispers, the men who said she couldn't handle the weight of command through a scope. She let all of it fall away until only the target remained. The transport reached the choke point. Elena exhaled and fired. The rifle bucked, the shot slicing through the night with its thunderclap. Her round smashed into the engine block, and in an instant the lead vehicle shuddered, smoke belching from its hood. It lurched sideways, grinding against the wall of the overpass, and stalled completely. The vehicles behind it skidded to a halt, confusion breaking their tight formation. Infantry scrambled out, shouting orders, trying to regain control, but the choke point did its work. The entire advance froze. Keller whooped softly beside her, then ducked as tracer fire ripped through the air. The enemy had spotted the muzzle flash. Rounds chewed through the walls around them, shattering concrete and glass. Elena stayed calm, pulling the bolt, chambering the next round. She had known the cost of the shot, and she had accepted it before her fingers squeezed. Now the fight wasn't about distance, it was about survival. She adjusted her scope again, picking off infantry who tried to repair the disabled vehicle. Each trigger pull was methodical, precise, her rifle speaking in deadly rhythm. Keller relayed her hits into the comms, rallying nearby squads to push forward and exploit the sudden stall. Minutes dragged into an eternity. The tower shook under retaliatory fire, chunks of debris raining around them. Keller cursed as a round grazed his helmet, but Elena never broke focus. Her role wasn't to feel fear, it was to anchor. Finally the comms crackled again, Dravik's voice urgent but triumphant. "Southern quarter is clear. Evacuation successful. Pull back and regroup." Elena allowed herself a single breath of relief. They had bought the civilians time. That was the mission, more than kills, more than legends. But the enemy wasn't done. More lights appeared in the distance, reinforcements beyond reinforcements. Elena felt the fatigue creeping in, the burn in her muscles from hours of tension, but she pushed it aside. The siege was no longer just about one impossible shot, it was about endurance. She glanced at Keller, who looked back with exhaustion etched deep in his face, but also trust. For the first time he didn't need to ask if she could handle it. He knew. The tower groaned as though it was alive, every burst of enemy fire rattling its weakened bones. Elena pressed herself low against the floor, listening to the sound of incoming rounds hammering the walls around them. Keller had already dragged their packs to a corner for cover, sweat dripping down his face in streaks that mixed with the gray dust clinging to his skin. The enemy was pouring suppressive fire into their position, and it was only a matter of time before they sent a squad to clear the building. Elena's eyes never left her scope, even as shards of glass rained around her. Through the chaos, she still tracked the bottleneck where the disabled vehicle lay. Infantry swarmed it like ants, some trying to cut a path around it, others attempting to tow it out of the way. Every time a soldier broke cover, her rifle cracked and another body hit the ground. Each shot wasn't just killing a man, it was buying another minute. And in war, a minute could be more valuable than a lifetime. Keller crouched beside her, shouting over the roar of gunfire. "They're pinning us in, Elena. We've got to move, or this whole building's gonna come down on our heads." His eyes darted toward the stairwell behind them, where dust sifted down from above. The enemy would know soon enough to flank. She pulled back from the scope for just a second, scanning their surroundings. The 12th floor gave them vision, but it was also a death trap. If they stayed, they'd be buried. If they ran too soon, the enemy would clear the bottleneck and the reinforcements would push through. She chewed her lip for a heartbeat, then made the call. "Not yet. We hold until they bring up heavy armor. Then we move." Keller stared at her like she was insane, but there was no hesitation in her voice. The siege wasn't about comfort or safety. It was about the line between survival and extinction. He exhaled sharply and muttered, "You're gonna get us killed," but he still reset his rangefinder, still fed her the numbers, still trusted her enough to stay. Together they rode out the storm, ducking when volleys chewed through the wall, rising only when Elena's reticle found another target. Her arms ached, her shoulder was a raw bruise, and her eyes burned from staring through the glass too long, but she forced her body to obey. A soldier's body could break later. Right now the only thing that mattered was discipline. Minutes blurred. Her kills mounted. And then, just as she predicted, the low growl of heavier engines rumbled into the distance. A tank. Its silhouette crested through the haze, barrel rising like the finger of death pointing directly at the tower. Elena's stomach clenched. She knew the tower wouldn't survive a single direct hit. She yanked her cheek from the stock and snapped at Keller, "Now! Move!" They grabbed their packs, bolted from the firing position, and sprinted for the stairwell as the tank fired. The entire floor shook as though struck by an earthquake. Concrete cracked, flames roared, and the section where Elena had been lying just seconds earlier collapsed in a thunderous crash. Dust filled the stairwell as they stumbled down, coughing, ears ringing from the blast. Floor by floor, they descended in half-darkness, the stairwell groaning under its own weight. They weren't alone. Echoes of boots clattered from below, enemy troops clearing the building from the ground up. Keller cursed, fumbling for his sidearm, but Elena shoved him toward a doorway and kicked it open. They burst into a shattered office floor, desks overturned and papers scattered like snow. The darkness cloaked them, but so did danger. She raised a hand, signaling Keller to hold. Through the broken windows, moonlight cut across the interior, and shadows danced where enemy flashlights flickered up the stairwell. They were trapped between two fires, armor outside, infantry inside. For a moment, Elena considered the weight of her situation. Many soldiers would call it hopeless. Outnumbered, outgunned, hunted. But she had never lived on hope alone. She had grown up surviving in tighter corners than this. The lesson she had learned young came back like instinct. Survival wasn't about strength. It was about silence, patience, and choosing when to strike. She pressed her back against the wall, rifle close to her chest, and waited. The enemy boots drew closer, voices muttering in a language that had become too familiar over months of war. Keller's breathing quickened beside her, but she touched his arm lightly, calming him. She raised her finger to her lips. They would wait. They would let the enemy come just close enough to believe they were safe. The first soldier rounded the corner, flashlight beams sweeping the wreckage. Elena moved faster than thought. Her suppressed pistol snapped once, the soldier collapsing silently before his light even registered the room. She darted forward, caught his falling body, and lowered it without a sound. Keller's eyes widened, but he followed her lead. Another soldier followed, whispering something to the dead man, unaware of the silence that had answered him. Elena pressed her pistol forward, another flash, another body. Two shadows lay still. She motioned Keller onward. They moved like ghosts through the floor, clearing their path one enemy at a time, never giving the rest above any clue that their men were already corpses. When they reached the 9th floor, Elena paused by the broken window and looked out. The disabled transport still blocked the overpass, smoke rising steadily. Infantry were now digging around it, trying to clear rubble by hand. The tank loomed beside it, its barrel scanning for more targets. If they stayed in the tower, they'd be trapped. But if they could reach street level and slip through the maze of alleys, they could reposition. She tapped Keller's shoulder and gestured down. He nodded, though his face was pale under the grime. They continued their descent, one careful step at a time, every creak of the stairs threatening to give them away. By the time they reached the 5th floor, the enemy above must have realized something was wrong. Shouts echoed through the stairwell, boots clanging faster. Keller cursed under his breath. They know. We're blown. Elena didn't hesitate. She kicked open a door, revealing another office gutted by shellfire. They sprinted across it, boots pounding against cracked tile, and leapt through a jagged opening where an entire wall had been torn away. For one terrifying second they were airborne above empty space. Then they hit the rubble slope on the 4th floor and rolled hard, pain jarring through their bones. Dust filled Elena's mouth, but she forced herself up, dragging Keller with her. Above, enemy shouts grew louder, beams of light stabbing through the gaps. They scrambled through the rubble into a back corridor, slipping into the stairwell again and continuing downward. The chase had begun. Elena's lungs burned, her body screaming for rest, but she knew rest was death. They burst onto the 2nd floor just as the tank outside roared again, blasting another section of the tower apart. The walls buckled and the entire structure shuddered violently. She didn't think. She grabbed Keller and shoved him toward the shattered exit, and together they dove into the night as the tower collapsed behind them in a thunder of steel and concrete. The shockwave hurled them across the street. Dust and debris rained down, choking the air. Elena rolled onto her stomach, ears ringing, vision swimming. The tower was gone, reduced to a smoking pile of rubble where they had been perched only minutes before. She coughed, spat grit, and forced herself to crawl forward. Keller groaned beside her, dazed but alive. She pulled him up, and together they staggered into the alley shadows. The enemy would assume they were dead in the collapse, but assumption was a luxury Elena never gave her enemies. They were alive, and as long as they breathed, the fight continued. Her comms crackled faintly, buried under static. She adjusted the frequency, finally catching Major Dravik's voice. Marquez. Keller, do you read? She pressed her mic, coughing out. Alive. Relocated. Tower gone. Relief was audible even through the distortion. Thank God. Pull back toward Grid 7. We're forming a new defensive line. You've done enough for tonight. Elena wiped the dust from her eyes, her lips tightening. No, sir. Not yet. We still have a window. If we don't hold them at the overpass, they'll push through before dawn. Dravik hesitated, then answered with the voice of a man who knew better than to argue with the only soldier who could see farther than the rest. Then make it count, Corporal. Just don't get yourself killed. Elena glanced at Keller, who was barely holding himself upright. His eyes said everything, fear, exhaustion, but also the unspoken question. How much longer can we keep this up? She didn't answer with words. She chambered another round into her rifle, her face grim under the moonlight. The siege wasn't over. Not until every last breath was spent. The night air was heavy with dust and smoke, every breath dragging grit into Elena's lungs as she and Keller moved through the narrow alleys. The collapse of the tower still echoed in her bones, the memory of its roar chasing them like a phantom. The enemy believed them buried in the rubble, that much was their only advantage. As long as they remained ghosts, unseen and unheard, they could still shape the battlefield. Elena's boots crunched lightly against debris as she slowed near the edge of a ruined courtyard. Through the broken slats of a fence, her scope caught the glint of enemy helmets, the silhouettes of infantry working tirelessly around the disabled transport. The bottleneck remained, but the enemy was adapting quickly. Engineers were laying charges, preparing to blast a hole through the obstruction. If they succeeded, the path would open before dawn, and everything Elena had bought with her impossible shots would vanish in smoke. Keller leaned against the wall beside her, his chest heaving. He was tough, battle-hardened, but exhaustion had etched itself into his frame. He had been running and fighting for hours without pause. Sweat streaked through the grime on his face and his voice rasped when he whispered, "They're gonna clear it. We can't stop all of them, not with just 2 rifles." His words weren't defeatist, they were honest. Elena adjusted her scope, tracking the engineers as they crouched with their charges. Each motion was precise, practiced, deadly in its intent. She could take 1, maybe 2, but more would replace them. She lowered her rifle slightly, her mind racing. "We don't need to stop all of them," she whispered back. We just need to stop the detonation. Keller frowned, confusion mixing with fatigue. What are you saying? She exhaled slowly, her eyes narrowing. If I can hit the explosives before they arm them, the blast will take out the engineers and block the choke point even worse. It'll buy hours, maybe the rest of the night. Keller swore under his breath, running a hand through his hair. That's not a shot, Elena. That's threading a bullet into dynamite from God knows how far, in the middle of smoke and moving bodies. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. He had seen her do the impossible once already. She adjusted her position, lying flat against the cracked pavement, the long barrel of her rifle resting steady on a chunk of concrete. Through the scope, the charges looked small, barely visible beneath the shifting bodies of the engineers. Her breathing slowed, her focus narrowing until the world beyond her reticle faded into nothing. Her finger brushed the trigger. The reticle danced with every beat of her heart, every ripple of air. She waited for the moment when one of the engineers lifted a charge into place, exposing it just enough. Her lungs froze halfway through a breath and she squeezed. The rifle thundered. The shot streaked through the night, and for a heartbeat there was only silence. Then light erupted, a blinding flash as the charge detonated prematurely. The engineers disappeared in the blast, their bodies hurled like ragdolls into the air. Fire and dust erupted across the overpass, and the disabled transport became fused with the rubble, a twisted barricade impossible to move quickly. Keller flinched at the explosion, then laughed hoarsely, shaking his head. You're insane, completely insane. And it worked. Elena didn't smile. She chambered another round, already scanning for the next threat. The explosion had drawn attention. Enemy spotlights swung wildly, voices shouting, weapons firing blindly into the smoke. They didn't know where the shot had come from, but they knew someone was still out there. Keller tugged at her sleeve. We've got to move before they sweep this sector. We can't stay in one place again. Elena gave a sharp nod, rising into a crouch, and together they melted back into the alleys, slipping deeper into the maze of ruins. Each step was a gamble, each shadow a possible ambush, but Elena's instincts guided them. Her childhood had taught her how to vanish, how to become the unseen whisper that stalked enemies from the dark. They reached a collapsed marketplace, stalls overturned, metal roofs crumpled into jagged heaps. Here, the city's past life lingered in eerie fragments. Fruit baskets turned to ash, faded posters clinging to walls, toys half buried in the dust. Keller paused, staring at a scorched doll lying in the rubble, its glass eyes cracked. He muttered softly, "Civilians were here not long ago." Elena crouched beside him, checking the ground. Fresh boot prints led through the market, heavy and numerous. Enemy patrols had passed here recently, maybe even now moving only blocks ahead. She raised a hand, signaling silence, and led Keller carefully through the wreckage. Halfway across the marketplace, the sound of approaching boots froze them both. Elena shoved Keller down behind an overturned cart just as a squad of enemy infantry emerged from the far side, rifles at the ready. They moved in disciplined formation, sweeping flashlights across the ruins. Elena's pulse quickened, but her breathing stayed steady. She slowly shifted her rifle, scope catching the lead soldier's face in the glow. One shot and the squad would scatter, but it would also bring the entire sector down on their position. She weighed the choice in seconds. Then, just as her finger began to tense, she caught sight of something on the squad's gear. One of the soldiers carried a comms pack, its antenna swaying above his head. Her mind clicked instantly. If they could take that pack, they wouldn't just kill a squad, they'd gain access to enemy channels, hear their movements, maybe even misdirect them. She leaned close to Keller, whispering so faintly it was almost inaudible. "Comms pack. We need it." His eyes widened. "That's suicide. There's at least 8 of them." She didn't argue. She adjusted her aim, waited for the moment when the squad clustered closest together, and fired. The shot took the comms operator clean in the chest, dropping him before the squad even registered the sound. In the chaos that followed, Keller opened fire too, his rifle barking short, controlled bursts. The marketplace erupted in gunfire. The squad scrambled for cover, shouting orders, spraying rounds into the shadows. Elena and Keller moved like phantoms, darting from one ruined stall to another, picking off targets with precision. Elena dropped one soldier with a round to the helmet, then another who exposed himself for half a second too long. Keller took 2 more, his bursts cutting through their armor. The survivors panicked, firing wildly, until Elena's final shot silenced the last of them. Smoke and echoes hung over the ruins as silence returned. Keller leaned against the rubble, panting hard, his rifle shaking slightly in his hands. 8 against 2, And we're still here. You're gonna kill me before the enemy does. Elena didn't answer. She moved to the fallen comms operator, ripping the pack from his body and slinging it over her shoulder. She adjusted the dials, static hissing until finally, enemy voices bled through. Orders, movements, reinforcements, they had cracked open the enemy's heartbeat. She looked at Keller, her eyes sharp even through the exhaustion. Now we know where they're going before they do. The night pressed on, endless and heavy. Elena and Keller slipped deeper into the ruins, listening to the stolen comms, using the enemy's own voice against them. Every squad that moved to flank the barricade found itself ambushed. Every attempt to breach the overpass met sudden resistance. And all the while Elena's rifle whispered death into the dark, each shot carving minutes, each kill buying lives. Her impossible shot had ended the siege once, but now it was her endurance, her refusal to break, that held the city together. The legend of her 2-mile kill had already spread, but what the soldiers on the line didn't see was the endless grind that came after. The war fought one breath, one bullet, one impossible choice at a time. The aftermath of the kill was supposed to feel like triumph, but it didn't. The outpost was safe, the siege broken, and her shot had made headlines across the command channels before the sun even dipped below the horizon. Yet, for Arden, the victory carried the same quiet weight as every other mission she had survived. After the adrenaline drained, what remained was silence, thick, oppressive, almost suffocating. The base celebrated without her. Soldiers toasted in the mess hall, laughter and clinking cups echoing through the narrow corridors, but Arden stayed on the roof of the control tower, watching the sky bruise into twilight. The rifle lay across her lap, cold metal against fatigued muscles. Every detail of the shot replayed in her head, the breathing, the slight nudge of the wind, the pull of the trigger. 2 miles away, a man who had commanded chaos was now nothing more than a body collapsing into dust. Everyone called it perfect. To her, it was inevitable. She wondered if perfection mattered when it always ended the same way. Someone gone, someone left behind, and a war that continued, indifferent to the names attached to its dead. Command didn't waste time capitalizing on the event. By dawn the next morning, Arden's name circulated in encrypted networks, paired with phrases like record kill, heroic defense, and legendary precision. She hated the words. They stripped the moment of its truth, twisting it into something consumable for morale. To the soldiers who had been trapped behind sandbags and barbed wire, she was a savior. To headquarters, she was a convenient symbol. To herself, she was simply the one who had pulled the trigger, no different than the dozens of times before, except that this time the number was larger, the distance longer, the stakes higher. The faces of those who had doubted her skill were the ones that haunted her now. She remembered the smirks during training, the muttered jokes about a woman carrying a rifle bigger than her shoulders, the constant shadow of being underestimated. That night, their silence had been louder than their laughter had ever been. Yet proving them wrong brought no comfort. It only highlighted the endless circle. Earn respect through violence, hold it only until the next test, start again. Sleep became impossible. The barracks felt claustrophobic, every corner whispering with voices she didn't want to hear. She found herself wandering the perimeter at odd hours, the desert wind clawing at her uniform, the silence punctuated by distant howls of jackals. She would walk until her legs ached, sometimes ending up back at the same rooftop where she had made the shot. Looking through the scope again, the world felt smaller, compressed into a narrow field of view where she was in control, where the chaos outside became lines, numbers, angles, all waiting to be solved. But outside the lens, life unraveled. She caught herself staring too long at her hands, wondering how many ghosts clung to her skin. It wasn't guilt. Guilt required regret, and she couldn't afford regret. It was something else, heavier, like carrying a storm that never broke. Then came the message. A direct summons, not through the regular chain of command, but through a secure channel reserved for missions far above the outpost scale. She was ordered to report to a forward operations hub several hundred miles east, where higher brass wanted her for special assignment. No details, no explanation, just an order she couldn't refuse. When she boarded the transport vehicle, the crew treated her like a relic, half in awe, half afraid to speak. News of her shot had spread further than she realized. She stared out the window during the long ride, watching the desert stretch into infinity, thinking of nothing but the moment the trigger had broken under her finger. She wished she could forget it, but forgetting was impossible. The world wouldn't let her. At the hub, reality sharpened. She was introduced to a new unit, one operating outside standard infantry protocol. They called themselves the Shade Company, A group of marksmen, recon specialists, and saboteurs used for missions most soldiers never even heard about. They welcomed her in silence, measuring her not by her rank but by the shot that had made her name impossible to ignore. Their leader, Captain Drex, a scarred man with eyes too calm for the brutality he commanded, laid out the situation with no preamble. The siege had been one battle. The war was larger, more dangerous, and leaders like the one she had killed were only fragments of a sprawling machine. Drex's unit didn't just fight battles. They cut off wars before they began, targeting the architects, the financiers, the hidden hands behind the chaos. Arden was to be their newest weapon, sharpened for precision beyond the battlefield. Her first mission with the Shades was a test of patience more than skill. They infiltrated an abandoned city where enemy commanders were rumored to be meeting, moving through ruined streets under cover of darkness. Arden lay prone on a crumbling rooftop for nearly 14 hours, the scope pressed against her eye, the weight of silence heavier than the rifle itself. She didn't pull the trigger that day, another marksman did, 3 rooftops away. But Drex wasn't watching the shot. He was watching her. When they returned, he told her she had passed. Not because she killed but because she hadn't. She had stayed steady, focused, waiting without error. In his words, killing is simple. Endurance is rare. She wondered if he saw the cracks forming beneath her calm exterior, the restless nights, the endless replay of moments she wanted to silence. Or maybe he saw and simply didn't care. In the Shade Company, pain was assumed. They all carried it, stitched into their skin like invisible scars. What unsettled her most wasn't the missions, but the way her legend grew with each one. Soldiers whispered her name like it belonged to a ghost story, a figure too precise, too distant to be real. She overheard rumors claiming she could see farther than any scope allowed, that she could shoot blindfolded, that her bullet carried luck. She despised the myths but she couldn't stop them. Every kill, every silent vigil on rooftops and ridgelines, added another layer to the story others told in her place. Arden the marksman, Arden the record breaker, Arden the one who turned sieges into seconds. Yet the truth was simple, she was tired. Tired of sand in her boots, tired of celebrating victories that felt like losses, tired of the silence that followed every trigger pull. But war didn't care about truth. War cared only about results, and Arden delivered them. One night, after a mission deep in hostile territory, she sat by a dying fire with Drex, the desert sky bleeding stars overhead. For the first time she asked a question she had never dared before. What happens when the war ends? Drex didn't look at her. He tossed a twig into the flames and let it crackle. For people like us, he said finally, the war never ends. It just changes names. His words sat heavy in her chest. She thought of the outpost, the siege, the 2-mile shot that had rewritten her life. She realized then that the war had carved her into something she no longer recognized. Not a soldier, not a savior, but a weapon. A weapon sharpened by disbelief, by necessity, by silence. A weapon that didn't know what to become once the fighting stopped. The 7th day of the siege dawned in an eerie stillness. For the first time since the enemy had surrounded the outpost, the distant thud of mortars and the staccato bursts of rifle fire were absent. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Inside the battered compound, soldiers stirred uneasily, their nerves frayed and their instincts telling them that silence was rarely a gift in war. Commander Halvorsen paced slowly across the command tent, eyes fixed on the maps spread out before him, tracing the red arcs that marked artillery ranges, infiltration paths and fallback routes. He knew the enemy was regrouping. They had suffered devastating losses when Adrienne's impossible 2-mile shot ripped through their command, but they weren't beaten yet. Men like the warlord leading this siege didn't bow out quietly. They would either break through with fury, or retreat under the cover of blood and smoke. Adrienne sat in her usual corner, carefully breaking down her rifle once more, cleaning it with steady, methodical hands. Her focus was absolute, but even she couldn't ignore the way the camp's energy had shifted. Her fellow soldiers gave her sideways glances, a mixture of awe and unease in their eyes. The shot she had made, the one nobody believed was possible, had turned her into a legend overnight. Yet with that legend came expectations, and she could feel the weight pressing down on her shoulders. If the enemy returned, and they surely would, people were going to look to her again, as if one rifle could carry the burden of an entire garrison. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. A part of her relished the chance to prove everyone wrong again, but another part whispered the truth. She was only human, and miracles could not be repeated forever. Still, she forced the thought aside. She had no time for doubt. Doubt killed faster than bullets. Outside the walls, The horizon shimmered in the desert heat. Through her scope, Adrian saw faint movements, scouts darting between dunes, riders cresting ridgelines only to vanish again, like shadows testing the edges of light. The enemy was probing, studying, trying to see where the defenses were weakest now that their leader was gone. She adjusted her sight, following one figure as it paused, raised binoculars, and then disappeared behind a rocky outcrop. The warlord's death had not ended the siege. It had only shifted it into a new, more dangerous phase. Without a central command, the enemy factions were unpredictable, but unpredictability could be worse than strategy. A desperate force was often the deadliest. Adrian reported the movements to Halvorsen, who nodded grimly. Reinforcements were still days away and supplies were running low. If the enemy mounted a coordinated push before then, the outpost wouldn't withstand it. The commander didn't say it aloud, but Adrian saw it in his eyes. They were standing on a knife's edge. By midday the silence broke. Mortars screamed again, shattering the fragile calm, raining fire onto the compound. Dust and shrapnel filled the air as soldiers scrambled to their posts. Adrian climbed the tower in 3 quick bounds, her rifle slung over her shoulder, lungs burning as adrenaline surged. She threw herself behind the sandbags and pressed her cheek against the stock, searching for targets. The enemy was charging in waves now, not caring about casualties, driven by vengeance or madness, maybe both. Hundreds of figures surged across the open desert, rifles flashing, banners whipping in the hot wind. Adrian exhaled, steadying her heartbeat, and fired. One after another, she dropped the charging figures, her rifle cracking in precise rhythm, every pull of the trigger another body falling. She felt herself slipping into that quiet place snipers sometimes reached, where time slowed and the chaos around them blurred into insignificance. Her world became nothing but breath, crosshair, and target. But even Adrian couldn't stop an army alone. The walls rattled under RPG impacts, machine gun nests blazed with suppressive fire, and medics dragged the wounded back through smoke-filled corridors. The compound shook with the fury of battle. Adrian's kill count climbed, but so did the pressure. Then, through the chaos, she spotted something that chilled her blood. A massive armored technical, bristling with heavy weapons, grinding forward like a beast of war. Its mounted cannon opened fire, shredding defenses, reducing barricades to splinters. If it breached the walls, the enemy would pour through like floodwater. Adrian knew she had seconds to act. She adjusted her scope, found the faint glimmer of a driver visible through the armored slit, and held her breath. The shot had to be perfect. At nearly 2,000 yards, under fire, with the ground shaking, this was beyond impossible. But she didn't flinch. She pulled the trigger. The round screamed across the desert, invisible death carried by her will alone. The driver slumped instantly and the technical veered sideways, crashing into a dune. The mounted gun sprayed wildly, then fell silent as the crew bailed out, cut down by her follow-up shots. A cheer rose from the defenders, raw and desperate, lifting spirits in the thick of hell. But Adrian didn't celebrate. She didn't even allow herself a smile. There was always another wave, another enemy, another fight waiting. And indeed more came. The siege didn't falter. If anything, the enemy seemed enraged, throwing themselves harder against the walls, heedless of losses. It was madness, a human tide battering against stone. Adrian's rifle grew hot in her hands, and sweat stung her eyes, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Every second she held the line meant another comrade survived. By nightfall, the compound was barely standing. Fires smoldered, ammunition was nearly gone, and the wounded outnumbered the healthy. Adrian leaned back against the sandbags, muscles trembling, exhaustion threatening to drag her under. Her rifle lay across her lap, its barrel scorched, its scope cracked. She had fired until her shoulder was raw, until her fingers ached from reloading. And still it hadn't been enough. The enemy had withdrawn for the moment, their bodies littering the sands, but Adrian knew they would return. This was no victory, only a pause, a gasp of air before the next plunge underwater. Yet as she looked around at her surviving comrades, at the way they still clung to hope despite the devastation, she felt something shift inside her. She was no longer the outsider, no longer the rookie who had to prove herself. She had become the symbol of resistance, the one they believed in. And with that came a burden she could neither accept nor refuse. That night, under a sky choked with smoke and stars, Adrian sat alone in the tower, watching the horizon. Her thoughts